Other than the floor sheeting being installed correctly and getting that right in the design piece, the membrane turn-ups are really critical here, and we see this all the time. And so there are minimum turn-ups to prevent the water entry carry over the top of the membrane. And this can be depending on where the balcony or deck is positioning. Is it beachfront? Is it facing in the direction where there's going to be heavy water? Or how much water would it be ponding and collecting? And we'll get into the drains later. Different levels of building heights in different areas, except, example, if you're in the cyclone areas north of Australia, this country is diverse, as we know, and all the conditions that we are exposed to. But whether you are north, south, east or west, rain will hit and decks leak, and the reality is that we've got to get that right with membrane turn-ups being judged correctly. Skirting tiles, this is the other big one we see. If you are going to have a skirting tile, which will allow you to treat it like a wet area system, then the membrane obviously can be turned up at the face of that wall substrate, skirting tile goes on it. However, it is very common for both clients and builders to not go to skirting tile, and so that turn up is still critical, and it needs to be timed and scheduled prior to the render or the texture system if that's the alternative, or if there's a cladding system that's going over the face of it. So really important on how we prepare that, and it's all in the timing of and the scheduling of how the membrane works happen. The other piece which is critical is ensuring that the membrane is not damaged during the installation process, and this also is an issue when you are applying it before. Let's say that you are going to have textures going over the top, and you often go there and the waterproofer has done a coving around the perimeter of a balcony or deck, and then you've had renderers or plasterers go in and do their texture and render, and then you have all the damage or all the overspill or spilled render or texture onto the substrate, and it's stuck to the membrane, and when you remove that you actually damage the membrane, and how that's all prepared and protected in the installation phase. These seem like little things, you might be going, are you kidding? No, I'm not kidding. These happen every day, and I'll show you photos of during you'll see the course of this video that are coming up like that, where you'll see damages that happen to membranes just because of lack of care from after trades or planning and preparing. Windows and door thresholds. This is a massive one. Sub-sill flashings as should be included as part of the membrane system. We see a major variation of what happens around the country. Okay, and if I looked at places like Queensland, I probably see a lot more of where membranes are carried up and over under the door thresholds prior to the windows before they are installed. Whereas other times you'll find waterproofers will rock up the site, windows and doors are in, and they might be left with this much space to actually return their membrane up. That is such a key area, because you can't expect the door sill or the window sill to protect a balcony that potentially could carry a lot of water, or you've got to plan on, in the event that that drain was flooded, how the water that balcony and substrate needs to hold that water, and that window and door threshold is critical. The requirements and timing of and coordination on when you schedule the waterproofing to be carried out there, and that is one that the waterproofer or the tiler or whoever's doing the work needs to work in with the building supervisor and the before and after trades. Very important, the communication piece here, because if the waterproofing is treated as sacred ground and everyone sort of makes sure that everything around that is protected, then it won't fail when it's done properly. But the problem is, good intention happens, guys go and waterproof it correctly, and then you just have a whole lot of after trades come across afterwards, and damage happens, and then it's all kaput from there. And the thresholds being pre-sealed, windows installed, the rest of the balcony waterproofed, that happens, most importantly, that should happen when you need to look at the types of window designs or the door designs. I mean, there are certain door sills and window sill designs now that allow for an overflow channel to happen. And when water, if you've ever been outside when you had a major rain on windows and just watched the way water reacts, particularly on a two-storey, it cascades down those windows and doors. And that piece there is, has the area been waterproofed well enough to allow for just constant water flow from that piece? And I'm going to talk about finished floor heights and door thresholds again shortly. Surface falls. This is the big one, and I'm going to talk a bit about screeds later, but establishing the minimum falls is critical. 1 into 100. Now, is that created with a substrate or is it created with a screed? We'll talk about screeds later, but let's talk about if it's going to be a direct fixed tile onto a balcony, that 1 in 100 fall needs to be implemented in the design when the floor sheeting is installed, and that's a critical one. You should be avoiding water ponding. Regardless if the membrane's there, it should always, if you're putting a hose on that floor, water should run off and it's going to have a direct stick tile application. If not, then you need to consider the screed and the waterproofing applied over the top of the screed to ensure water doesn't pond on that floor. The other piece of it was water getting under screeds, which is an important one. You may be screeding a floor, but if you have, even though you might say, okay, we've waterproofed the base, and then you've waterproofed, you put a screed on top of the base membrane, when water gets through that screed and sits on that base, it's constantly wet, and this is a lot more water outside than what you get in a bathroom or a shower, and that is going to contribute to efflorescence, and that is another major issue in the industry at the moment with staining of grouts, efflorescent stains through tiles. It all comes back to the design and how we're implementing that screed system and how the waterproofing handles in that situation. I mentioned before about these designs, these manuals from Hardie's and similar ones like that. You'd be shocked if you actually see, and I'll say that again, on the way some of these ideas and concepts are here on how we actually should have membranes applied and where the falls are and where they should be graded along. I mean, one example here that I'm looking at on the Skyon one that always comes to mind, but Hardie's Skyon detail, and this will be shown up on the screen, but it shows that the only correct way of building a deck is having water run off the face of an edge balcony, not with a puddle flange in the middle. And yet, how many balconies would you see out there that have got drains in the centre, very similar to a bathroom situation? So these are little things that come into the, as I said before, about the installation of what the floor sheets are and getting those falls right. And the other piece of it, as I mentioned before, is drummy tiles. You might have efflorescence come up, but if you've got constant moisture sitting on a balcony that's got no falls and the water sitting in the drainage is inadequate, over time when that water sits there, sun gets up on those tiles, you're going to get drummy tiles as a phenomenon which is common, and that's going to be another issue. So the surface falls are a major one. Now I'm going to talk about finished floor heights and door thresholds just on this piece now, because this is one that annoys me a lot, and this is where I see the disconnect in the industry. Many years there's been an argument out there, and I've spoken to different building consultants where they'll come to a manual like this, and when you read a manual like so, it tells you that you should have a finished floor, you should have a rebate between the membrane and the door of 100 mil. And then I was looking at Hardie's manual before, and it refers to the finished floor level. Yet many builders, when they build these decks, will judge that height from the floor sheet that gets installed. And so if they are allowing for a screen to be installed on top, which could be 80 mil or greater near the doorway, that might leave 20 mil. And then you've got to put the tile on top. So your finished floor level is the top of the tile, and that height is nowhere near enough of what's recommended. And so the issue is judging all that. That may need to be, if I've got an 80 mil screed and I've got to allow for a tile, then the rebate needs to be far greater and taken into account. Okay, and this whole design phase. So that finished floor level is one, if I go around to different people and talk to 10 different people in the industry at the moment, they'll have a different opinion on what that means. Hardie's have taken care to cover themselves on that with their recommendations. It's probably one of the better details I've seen out there, but we have no direction from the BCA or the standards in terms of what is common practice around the country on this part of it. What I am seeing now, and many of you would be seeing out there, is the use of pedestal pavers on balconies and decks. That does overcome that to a certain extent because you don't have a screed underneath which is just absorbing water. So the finished floor level, the water is designed to get through the joints of those pavers, and so that finished floor level can be built into the whole system from the way that design is. But steel tiling is the most preferred finish out there, and hence that finished floor level and the door threshold is a major one. So getting that right for me is a big piece. I've seen beachfront properties where they've had the floor sheeting installed with 100 mil rebate. By the time that tiling is finished, it might be 10 to 15 mil protected by a silicon bead on that tile, and when that water hits from a rain or a pushing wind towards that doorway, you're actually putting a lot of duress on that system, and it's not compliant. So that needs to be taken into account. Drainage. Okay, where do I start and finish on this one? Probably goes hand in hand when we talk about screeds, but the thing is, adequate drainage is the key. Just like any wet area, I mentioned before about having a 1 in 100 fall. If we're talking about floor waste, and let's talk about not what Hardie's detail might state, but what a concrete floor would have, and you've got a larger balcony or podium. The floor waste need to be allowed to ensure that, and particularly if you've got parapets around and you may not be able to design it with a fall to the edge, those drains and floor waste need to allow for the worst case scenario to drain water away. That is very, very important. And so, again, you go to the manuals of the manufacturers of the substrates, they'll have their detail on it. However, on our end of it, the floor waste design needs to ensure that it can contain the water to drain away. Okay, so whether you've got a screed system going on top, or if it's a direct stick, that once that is in place, those drains are allowing all the contained water from a heavily rained on area to fall. And like I had in one of our previous episodes on puddle flanges, same thing applies. The way you install a puddle flange and the membrane termination is very, very critical. It shouldn't sit proud of the floor, it needs to be rebayed into the system. Penetrations. How many times we see penetrations fail a balcony system because you've had balustrades or posts that are installed post the waterproofing, and they're just being penetrated through a bit of silicone on top of the tile finish, and it's a weak point. You can't drill through a membrane. These are the things that need to be planned earlier. What are we going to do? Do you need to call the waterproofer back before, after those posts are installed if they can't be installed prior to the membrane system being applied? These are things that are very, very important. No one's just going to drill through a membrane and expect it to be warranted out there to the elements. So a critical piece. And the termination points of membranes is the other big one. Edges of balconies, the turn downs. You know, you'll see some photos now that on the screen. There was a couple of balconies that I've seen that had just been left exposed with the tile finish on the, and instead of being filled and terminated down with a membrane, they just filled it with some tile adhesive underneath those tile beds to the blue board, and when that's facing the weather, the water will come in underneath it. How we terminate membrane systems and ensure that we silicone, seal, cork, do all the right things in conjunction with the termination points are critical. Tiled angles, there's some great designs out there at the moment on how you can finish tiles to the balcony edges to allow to prevent both water coming back into underneath the screed or the tile bed and draining away all the excess water that you can have in that situation that will be drained away through the tile bed. These are things that are really, really important to take note of. This is a tiling trade, I understand that piece, with how they are implemented or integrated into their tiling finish, but it doesn't mean that the tile has to do the waterproofing. It needs to be in conjunction between the design, the waterproofer and that after trade. So important one to take note on, because membrane terminations, how you finish a membrane off, is as important as how you install the membrane.